In this session until lunch, we'll learn how instrumental ethics has been in other fields and to understand if there's any promise for applying ethics in a digital world. So what is ethics? Who defines ethics and who do ethics serve? To address these questions and more, we are fortunate to have with us today Anita Allen, Professor of Law and Philosophy from the University of Pennsylvania, an expert on privacy, data protection law, and ethics. In her recent article in New Europe, she said that the focus on ethics in relation to digital life is a sign of a serious problem. Please use the app to send your questions for a short Q&A with her following her presentation. In the meantime, please welcome Professor Anita Allen.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. We've heard some amazing speakers, and I've been given a very, very, very tough job, which is to say something about ethics in general. What is this thing? What is this great beast we call ethics? So ethics are our moral values, and they're cornerstones of civilization. More precisely, ethics are the values that define virtue and obligation, responsibility, and well-being. The modern word English comes from a Greek word, I believe it's pronounced ethike, which was roughly translated by my philosophy teachers as character, moral character. However, today, the word ethics is used broadly to refer to moral concerns about conduct as well as about character. A perhaps uniquely human capacity, ethics combine conduct and character in practical understandings of what's required if we are to live well, both for our own sakes, but also for the sake of those whose fates we must share. The subject matter of ethics extends to the entirety of moral life, personal and public. I'll speak about it broadly here, but I just want to mention a couple of narrower uses of the word ethics. Sometimes ethics is used narrowly as a synonym for personal morality. Sometimes ethics is used broadly to refer to a branch of academic philosophy. And then finally, sometimes ethics is used narrowly to refer to professional ethics, as in the ethics of lawyers or doctors, or business people, corporations, or engineers, software engineers. Living well requires responsible choices and adherence to common virtues. Trustworthiness, for example, is vital to every facet of just and humane lives. Every person in every professional relationship, every financial transaction, and every democratic institution thrives on trust. Openly embracing ethical standards and consistently living up to them remain the most reliable ways that individuals and businesses can earn the respect on which all else depends. So ethics matter. In both their secular and their religious aspects, ethics are practical guides to moral right and wrong, to moral good and bad, to justice and injustice. The law, of course, is also a practical guide. But ethics and law are distinguishable. They're often convergent, but they're distinguishable. They converge, philosophers have explained, because in distant times they were the same thing. There was no such thing as ethics separate from law, one big set of norms. But in modern times, they've become very distinct, and they coexist as different kinds of social mechanisms. One official and politically authoritative, one not. But they both address the same human limitations and problems. Obviously, the law and ethics differ as to sanctions. You don't go to jail, you don't go to prison, you don't pay a fine for an ethical violation. You may be embarrassed or ostracized. But if you commit a crime, you can end up in jail. Is ethics, however, a criterion for the legitimacy of law? Is ethics a criterion for the legitimacy of law? Well, in what's known as the natural law tradition of jurisprudence, This tradition identifies laws as rules of reason, not requiring specific positive acts of legislation or judgment. So yes, ethics would be a criterion for legitimacy of law. But this conception of law has been criticized as conflating law with morality and potentially undercutting the efficacy of law. Now, there's an opposing jurisprudence called the positive law tradition, which asserts that laws have authority because they are products of legitimate sovereigns, even if they're unjust. Well, obviously, this philosophy could be criticized because it might seem to potentially dignify tyranny. So we can't dive deeply into legal philosophy this morning, exploring the relationship between law and ethics in detail. Suffice it to say that we are here to discuss digital ethics, not to challenge the validity of impressively updated data protection law, but we're here to better understand the moral values which society could and should promote. So digital ethics is emerging as a field of practical or applied ethics. Digital ethics are an occasion for exploring how, in relation to digital technology, the lives, the interests, and the welfare of others make claims on us. How can we reconcile the claims that other people make on us with our own goals? What should be our goals in relation to technology and innovation? What should be our goals? And how should we live our lives in a world shaped by social media, the Internet of Things, and AI? Let me then say a little bit more, as I was asked to do, about the nature of ethics in general, the topic that, again, I was asked to address. So in our private lives, ethics bear on the special loyalties and commitments we feel towards our family and our friends and our neighbors. In our public lives, we trust that our ethics are respected as the ideal foundations of public policy and law and professional standards. We need ethics. We have ethics for a reason. As human communities confront the realities of limited resources and naked self-interest, our ethics inspire us to be better, to care for ourselves, and to care for other people. Ethical principles that tell us not to lie or cheat or break promises function constructively to make group life more predictable and peaceful. As we confront the realities of illness and suffering and death, ethics can point to sources of genuine meaning in our inevitably finite lifespans. Achievement and generosity can help give us meaning. Where do ethics come from? How are they learned? Well, everyday ethics come from everyday life and may live for ages, like the ethical principles that countermand various forms of dishonesty. They live for ages. We're taught ethics directly and indirectly in families, in churches, in synagogues, in temples, in schools, in mosques. Professional ethics arise from organized professional groups, establishing guidelines for their own conduct in their respective fields of practice. Professional ethics may be more specific than general ethics or even at odds with them. Philosophical ethics arise among debates and exchanges among intellectuals in universities and cultural institutions. That's how ethics come about in those various ways. European cultures have produced a plenitude of compelling philosophical ethical thought. Most obviously, the Greeks produced the philosopher Plato, and the originator of virtue ethics, Aristotle. The Germans gave us Immanuel Kant. Kant's famous categorical imperative demands that we treat rational, free, autonomous persons with respect as ends in themselves, never as means. The English contributed Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill, moral utilitarians who focus on the path to improved human welfare through maximization of pleasure and happiness. More recently, the French contributed Emmanuel Levinas, for whom ethics was the first philosophy, a confrontation with the other. Jean-Paul Sartre, who insisted that we boldly confront our existential freedom and responsibility, was an important contributor to 20th century ethics. And finally, I can only give a few examples, but the Spaniard José Ferrater Mora thought an inclusive ethics that situated animals as well as human beings in a common moral domain. After World War II, the peoples of Europe and the world were offered declarations and covenants and charters elegantly and simply stating human rights principles that affirmed their worth, our worth. These formulations have come to pervade legal and political culture around the globe. They encompass fundamental principles of dignity, respect, freedom, security, self-determination, democracy, privacy, identity, community, fairness, equality. These are values we consider to be virtually universal. To say this is not to deny that the details of moral life can differ from one community or country to the next. But it is to say that many general values are shared and can be the basis of collective reflection about how to respond to change, the change occurring in the data-driven society. There is something vital at stake for us, whether we're from Asia or the Americas or Africa or Australia, in having this conversation. There are those who see moral skepticism, subjectivity, and relativism as defeating any international body, such as this one, from identifying general or universal normative ethical standards. Let's say something about this. Well, we live in a diverse, multicultural world, to be sure, and there are competing interests and ideals, individual, social, economic, political, and religious. This diversity challenges the very idea of a single moral community with universal and objective values shared by all. We can describe our ethics as a community, and we can theorize meta-ethically as a community, but there is a basis for objective consensus. Or is there not? Whose rules? Whose standards? Who decides? The problems of relativism subjectivity will lead some, not me, but some, to conclude that ethics is just another name for the requirements imposed by those with religious authority or political or economic power to push their agendas over and give them cover. However rich, the ethical resources of the past are not enough. They're not enough, and we all need to live ethically well in the future. We must realistically confront the challenges that ethics pose for us today. We still have the old challenges, moral weakness of will, impulsivity, rationalization. We know that people set aside the ethical point of view and deliberately pursue self-interest, whenever doing so seems smart and profitable. People will be opportunistic, selfish, discriminatory, and cruel. But the 21st century has added complexity to ethical life beyond those problems and challenges. Science is transforming the kinds of lives we can expect to live. Technology has presented new options for the food we eat, the cars we drive, the medications we take, how we communicate. Our options give us bigger say in the design of our lives. Other speakers this morning have emphasized this. We now have choices in the design of our lives and in the future of our planet, and hence we have more moral responsibility than ever before. In unfamiliar situations brought on by science and technology, ordinary people are understandably uncertain. We can be baffled, confused, underinformed about the facts that we need to live well and responsibly with technology. We can sometimes even fail to recognize that the options with which we are presented have ethical implications, ethical dimensions. Ethical or moral disruption is the phenomenon of moral certainty in the face of innovation and change. And we're in a period of ethical disruption right now. As society changes, what seems right and wrong may change, or even unfathomable. Ethical novelty introduced by technological innovations leave us uncertain about how best to live. Moral reasoning cannot easily keep up with the pace of technological change. Cell phones, computers, internet, search engines, social media, drones, AI, big data, autonomous cars, you name it. Life is not what it used to be. 200 years ago, the central challenge of being a good person, living well, was coping well, coping with social disadvantages and biological perils, disease, for example, for which there were no drugs yet. Ethics primarily required taking the high road called for by virtue and good and right and wrong. The correct path was generally clear, you just had to follow it. I believe today the biggest challenge is no longer coping well, but rather choosing well. We're ethical trailblazers, bound to traverse perilous terrain, some mapped, a good deal unmapped. If we are to live ethically, we need to prepare ourselves for the novel challenges of the new ethical landscape, including the digital ethical landscape. Now, in recent years, the General Data Protection Regulation has been moving forward, and Supervisor Giovanni Buttarelli began urging greater attention to ethics. His ethics advisory group, chaired by J. Peter Burgess, issued a report recently, 2018, that called for rethinking of traditional European values of dignity, personhood, and democracy. This conference is a unique opportunity to explore the implications of how technology is affecting everyday life. The problems that we're facing today, that the focus on ethics could be a sign that something is very, very wrong, that we're in a crisis. And I think that sometimes the call for ethics is a sign of crisis. In my own country, for example, the demand for ethics sometimes follows major political scandals or fraud or self-dealing in financial sectors or misconduct or cruelty by health professionals or medical researchers or dishonesty by the very judges who are asked to oversee institutions of justice. So I have to ask, what is happening or not happening today in the EU that's calling for the emphasis on ethics? I think we know what that is. It's data breaches, interference with elections, spying on world leaders, non-consensual data protection, big data analytics, profiling and discrimination. We know also it's concerned that we look harder at the kind of society we're becoming because of our reliance upon technology. So the ethical call here is, in some sense, a response to a sense of crisis, but it's also, in some ways, and I prefer to think of it this way, it's proactive, because we haven't yet had the great disaster, ethical disaster we might have if we fail to explore the deeper questions as to the impact of a data-driven society on dignity, freedom, and the functioning of democracy. Let me conclude by saying that we must, with skill and knowledge and resources, strive to be both intentional in the design and use of technologies and creative in exploiting technology's power to advance human good. I thank you.